Bastinado. Bastinado is a punishment where the victim is tied down and beaten with a light rod, knotted cord, or lash, but exclusively on the soles of the feet. It was widely used across the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and parts of East Asia from medieval times well into the 19th century, often as judicial punishment for minor crimes or as a tool to extract confessions. Unlike most flogging, the goal isn't injury, it's pain. The soles are packed with nerve endings, so even light strikes send waves of agony through the entire body. Victims often couldn't walk for weeks. Done too long or too hard, the feet would swell grotesquely, skin split open, and some victims lost the ability to walk ever again. It's low on this list because it's rarely fatal, but the screaming it produced was said to be some of the most piercing heard in any prison. Pitch capping. Pitch capping takes that same logic and adds permanence. It was a favorite tactic of British forces against Irish rebels during the 1798 rebellion. Hot pitch or tar, sometimes still bubbling, was poured into a paper cone and forced down onto the victim's head like a helmet. It was left to cool and harden directly against the scalp, fusing with hair and skin. Then it was ripped off in one violent motion, tearing away chunks of scalp, hair follicles, and raw tissue, leaving the skull partially exposed. It wasn't designed to kill outright, but the wounds rarely healed clean, and the infections that followed killed just as effectively, only slower and more painfully. Elephant's foot. The elephant's foot had two settings, mercy and theater, and it was used for centuries across the Mughal Empire and other South Asian kingdoms as public execution. In the merciful version, the victim's head rested on a stone pedestal, and the elephant's foot came down once, crushing the skull instantly. In the version royalty preferred as entertainment for gathered crowds, trained elephants were taught to walk over the limbs first, slowly crushing hands, feet, arms, and legs into pulp over repeated passes, while the victim remained fully conscious and screaming, before the animal finally stepped on the head to finish it. Same execution, completely different amount of suffering, depending entirely on how much the audience wanted to watch. Poena coulae. Poena coulae was reserved in ancient Rome specifically for parricides, people who murdered their own fathers, since Roman law considered this crime so unnatural that ordinary execution wasn't fitting. The condemned was stripped, beaten with rods until bloodied, then sewn shut inside a leather sack alongside a dog, a venomous snake, a monkey, and a rooster, all four animals thrashing and biting in panic against the victim in total darkness. The sealed sack was then thrown into a river or the sea, leaving the victim to drown slowly while being torn at by terrified animals who had nowhere else to go. Blowing from a gun. Blowing from a gun sounds horrifying and is actually one of the more merciful entries here, which is exactly why the British Empire used it extensively during colonial uprisings in India, tying rebels directly to the mouths of loaded cannons in front of assembled crowds. The cannon was fired and death was instant, the head disintegrating and vanishing upward, while the arms tore off and flew outward, sometimes landing over 100 yards away. Whatever the visual horror for onlookers, the body had no time to register pain, which made it one of the few entries on this list that was arguably worse to witness than to experience. Castor oil barrels. Castor oil barrels became infamous under Mussolini's fascist regime in 1920s Italy as a humiliation tactic against political dissidents. Victims were forced to drink enormous quantities of castor oil, triggering violent, uncontrollable diarrhea within minutes. They were then sealed inside human-sized wooden barrels and left there for hours, sometimes days, forced to sit in their own waste as it accumulated around them. In extreme cases, the person was left long enough that they drowned in their own bodily fluids before anyone opened the barrel again. Immurement. Immurement is simpler and somehow worse, practiced across medieval Europe and parts of Asia as both an execution method and a form of permanent imprisonment for crimes like treason or breaking religious vows. A person was sealed alive into a tiny enclosed space, often bricked directly into a wall with barely enough room to sit. As an execution, no food or water was ever provided, and death came slowly over days through starvation and dehydration inside total darkness. As a lifelong punishment, small amounts of food were passed through a slot, extending a living burial for years or even decades. The rack. The rack stretched the body until it physically stopped cooperating, used widely across the Spanish Inquisition and English Tower of London well into the 17th century. The victim's wrists and ankles were bound to rollers at either end of a wooden frame, and with each turn of the crank, the joints separated further. Shoulders and hips dislocated audibly, ligaments tore, and in extended sessions, limbs were pulled fully out of their sockets. It was built primarily for interrogation, but pushed far enough it became a slow execution in its own right. The pear of anguish. The pear of anguish, allegedly used during the Spanish Inquisition, was a metal device inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina, and then expanded through a screw mechanism at the top. As the screw turned, 4 metal petals spread outward inside the body, tearing through soft internal tissue, sometimes far enough to reach vital organs, all while the victim remained conscious for the entire slow expansion. Aztec live heart removal. Aztec priests performed live heart removal atop the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan as an offering to Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, sometimes sacrificing dozens of captives in a single ceremony. The victim was stretched backward over a curved sacrificial stone, chest arched upward, while a priest sliced through the abdomen and diaphragm with an obsidian blade and reached inside to tear the still beating heart free, holding it toward the sky while the body was kicked down the temple steps. The heretic's fork. The heretic's fork was used during the Inquisition to force confessions from accused heretics. A metal collar with sharp prongs at both ends was strapped around the neck, one set digging into the underside of the chin, the other into the sternum, forcing the head to stay upright indefinitely. Whenever exhaustion set in and the head began to droop, the prongs pierced deeper into flesh, so victims were trapped in a cycle of agonizing muscle failure and self-inflicted puncture wounds that could last for days without sleep.